Okay, welcome in. And in part four of our discussion on J.R.R. Tolkien's inspirations, we are going to be looking at a little bit of what we might consider a wide variety of topics, but they all do relate along a similar thread. And the overall goal of tonight is to explain a little bit about how Tolkien's mind tried to wrap all of this life experience into a a unified process of creativity. And we're going to be adding a couple of additional in depth looks at a couple of regions, and then we are going to give a bit of an explanation in Tolkien's own words on how he came up with some of this stuff, and then we will look at, again, some of the actual work itself. So, one of the most important elements that we've referenced in previous episodes of our series here is Tolkien's religion. And this is actually a very, very important part of Tolkien's character overall, and it deserves a little bit more of an in depth look. And of course, this is going to start with his mother, Mabel. Uh, Mabel Tolkien was going to be left in a very unfortunate position when her husband Arthur, this is Tolkien's father, passes away. Mabel is left to raise two young boys, basically by herself in England. And while she does have several family members that are going to help her both financially and with the children, Mabel is very much going to try to do as much of this as she can by herself. And one of the things that becomes very important to her is her faith. And she converts to Catholicism, which did not necessarily sit too terribly well with her family, who were not Catholic, but this is going to be something that is going to affect Ronald and Hilary, her sons. Ronald is going to take his first communion in 1903 at Christmas time, and he's going to see the Catholic faith as part of his relationship with his mother. And when she dies not too long after, the event is a very traumatic one for both Ronald and Hilary, but specifically Ronald is going to look at this as a sort of abandonment, and the treatment that he had witnessed between his family and his mother was one that was going to stick with him for the rest of his life. And later on in his life, when questioned or in letters, he builds a bit of a picture where he attempts to explain his mother's faith and her death almost as a martyrdom. Now, she died from diabetes, which was not something that was easily treated during the early 1900s, but the negative repercussions that came from her conversion were going to definitely make the situation worse. And it was the Catholic faith that stepped in to help both Mabel while she was still alive and the boys. And this was in the form of both financial support and during a period of time where Mabel was attempting to recover from some hospital stays, even a place to live. So the early exposure that Ronald and Hilary had to the Catholic faith was an important one. And if we want to sort of look at what they looked like around the time that their mother died, this is a photograph that's fairly close to that period of time. We see Ronald here in the big hat. This is Hilary, his younger brother. And the faith that they had was tied to, at that point, their livelihood, because they were being cared for by the church effectively, because their guardian was this gentleman here, Father Francis Morgan. We've talked about him several times in the series. He was their caregiver and arranged for their living facilities and stepped in to offer guidance and support and took them on holiday when he could. And their life was really, again, centered around the church. Now, when Ronald started growing up a bit more and got into school, he ran into a situation that was a bit to be expected. Catholicism in England was not the majority religion. The majority of people at that time would have been Anglican, the Church of England. And the history between Catholics and Anglicans in England has not always been necessarily what we would call comfortable when it comes to toleration and respect for each other in a sort of mutual Christian faith sort of way. But most of the friends that Tolkien is going to run into during his young life aren't going to be Catholic. And in fact, his most, what we might call his closest friend, this gentleman here, Christopher Wiseman, is not a Catholic either. And one of the things that we see both in Tolkien's diaries and in letters and in later discussions that he had with his biographer was that one of the things that Tolkien respected so much about Wiseman when they were young was that they could differ in religious opinion, but they still respected each other. And this is going to bolster Tolkien's respect for himself, as well as give him somebody that he can talk to that's sort of outside of the situation that he's in. Wiseman was from a much better off family than Tolkien, and this was an outlet that Tolkien really loved, and they sort of considered themselves brothers, even in their younger groups like the TCBSs. Tolkien and Wiseman always sort of considered themselves the two pillars, or the great two brothers. They were the core, if you will, and it's notable to point out that the situation that Tolkien faced in World War I might have been significantly different if Wiseman had been one of his friends that died. Of the four, what we might call foundational members of the Tea Club, two of them died, and Tolkien and Wiseman were the two that survived. So that could have been a fairly uncomfortable situation if Tolkien had lost what he sort of considered his greatest friend. Now, we've also talked about how his religion is going to affect his relationship with his wife. This is a picture of Edith. This is from their marriage portrait. Edith was originally not someone that he was allowed to date, partially because he was too young, and partially because Edith was not a Catholic. She was of the Church of England, and the relationship that he had with Father Francis was going to be of utmost importance to him. And when Edith converted to Catholicism, this is when Father Francis finally gave them the okay to get married. And Edith did not necessarily have the easiest time converting to Catholicism. This was something that caused a bit of an estrangement between her and part of her family as well. And it's also something that didn't necessarily go away quickly. There are reports from Tolkien's biography and from his journals and his letters that they're even sometimes going to have arguments about this. And at least one occasion in 1940, they seem to have a fairly large argument, specifically revolving around Catholicism. And basically what ends up happening is that Edith sort of goes along with what Ronald sort of says, and that seems to be sort of the end of the discussion, but we don't necessarily know exactly how she felt about that. And Tolkien's Catholicism is absolutely going to be something that he passes down to his children. His youngest son, Christopher, of course, is going to be very close to his father and took up the faith with relish. He also has a son, John, who actually went so far as to become a priest. In 1946, John Tolkien was ordained as a Catholic priest. So the whole family is going to be involved in this, and this is something that he was very, very serious about. And the reason I mentioned this in such depth at this particular point is because of the implication behind the way that Tolkien thought of himself as a Catholic and thought of himself as a writer. And this is going to get to a very important idea that Tolkien himself espoused, and he called himself a sub-creator. Now, this is a critical idea to understanding Tolkien and to understanding how he thought the process should sort of play out. And this is absolutely something that is rooted in his faith. Subcreation to him was essentially a religious idea. And he explained it that God himself was the one that created the universe, and humans, as an attempt to find common ground with God or to approach God in a way, not necessarily an apotheosis, not an attempt at becoming God, but as an attempt to find common ground or to emulate God, what humans would do is exercise creativity. And that is the way that he really approached the whole concept of writing, that he was creating something new. He was bringing into existence these new ideas and these new people and these new settings and these new worlds. And in doing so, he was emulating the creation of the universe. And this is something that seems a bit perhaps esoteric, or maybe even a bit maybe silly if this is something that, you know, is well outside of your particular religious ideology. But the idea here is one that Tolkien not only believed himself, but also talked about quite a bit with his friends. And this is going to lead to a lot of the reasons he makes decisions. One of the earliest motivations behind his writing was this desire to create some sort of body of mythological work that would tie all of the British history together. And one of the ways that he's going to explain the need for this is by saying that he is going to offer something to the people as a way for them to come together because of the divisions that existed among them, right? If everybody could find some sort of common ground, we could put aside differences, and it's not too far of a stretch to understand that one of the differences that he felt fairly clearly was religious difference. And when we talk about sub-creation or being a sub-creator, one of the things that is going to sort of be a struggle is the desire to create something that is perfect, but the thing that gets created never actually managing to be perfect. And this is a struggle that Tolkien will run into time and time again, where what he wants to do is create something that is historically and linguistically and intellectually and fictionally perfect. And by doing so, he will breathe new life into these characters, and he will create things that take place in people's minds, and he'll have this effect of creation in the world. But it has to be done the right way. And just like any undertaking that ultimately derives from an interpretation of a religious idea, this brings a lot of pressure right? Because Tolkien was very aware that he was an imperfect individual, and would say so, and does say so quite frequently. And what he wants to do is almost unreachable, right? It's almost not within the scope of human capability. But that doesn't mean he wasn't going to try, because he felt this calling, and he saw his imagination and his creativity as a force that was driving him to encompass these new worlds with a fully fleshed out creation. And it's impressive what he managed to accomplish. Whether or not he was ever actually happy with what he wrote is a different scenario, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we sort of go through. But one idea that's also important for us to sort of wrap our minds around at this point is his view of history. Specifically, whether or not history had to have happened to be real. Now, that seems perhaps spurious. If history didn't happen, how can it be real? But this is not something that Tolkien had an issue with. To him, writing something that had historical elements within it inherently made it real. And when asked why he liked to write stuff like fairy stories or write about all of these worlds that didn't exist, one of his responses was, just because they didn't happen doesn't mean they don't exist. Because again, and this loops right back into this concept of sub-creator status or sub-creation. If he wrote the history and people could read that and feel the same way that they felt when they read actual history, and if people could look at the language of the people in his stories and learn those languages the same way they could learn a language that was spoken by people on Earth, what he was doing then was making something that was real. And it wasn't fake just because it didn't happen that way. And this is, again, somewhat of a difficult concept to understand, but it all goes back to this concept again, that what he wants to bring into the world is reality on a level that he can control and manipulate. And if you read the introduction to The Lord of the Rings, one of the things that he talks about so frequently in work, and specifically in the introduction, is this concept of allegory, and how he didn't necessarily like using allegories, because to him, what he would prefer is to just write history or war or events in a historical format, and it didn't matter if they didn't happen, because he wasn't trying to create something that mimicked a situation that already exists. He wasn't trying to, make Mordor equal Nazi Germany. He wasn't trying to make Gandalf equal Jesus. What he was trying to do was make something that was new, that people could relate to, but also that was real, and that you could learn the same lessons from. And there's an important distinction there between that and the concept of allegory. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that life experiences and all of the stuff that we go through on a day-to-day basis and all the things that we encounter and all the conversations that we have are going to have an effect on us. And despite the fact that Tolkien didn't care for allegory that much, that doesn't mean that none of the things that he wrote had allegorical implication or didn't have some sort of real-world motivation. We've already talked about multiple examples of how the real world and things that he experienced influenced what he wrote. But it is important for us to understand that he ultimately would not like the concept of allegory, because what he was doing was sub-creating a universe instead of copying a universe that already existed, if that makes any sense. And I know that a lot of people very frequently ask about this concept of allegory and why Tolkien didn't like it. And I hope that this has been a much more in-depth and thorough discussion about why specifically he did not care for the concept of allegory, because to him it was not analogous to what he wanted to do with his writing. So how did his religion give some specific examples? So we can actually point to quite a few of these in his work. Most notably, when we talk about elves, the concept of elves in Lord of the Rings is a central one. It is a big part of the story. Of course, if you read the larger Middle-earth arcana and you read the Silmarillion or some of the histories or the unfinished things like the Book of Lost Tales or the Unfinished Tales, you're going to find out that there are actually many more stories that involve elves than there are stories that involve pretty much any other race. And Tolkien was very aware that he had made a significant difference between elves and men. And if you read the creation story that's in the early parts of the book, the Silmarillion, you will understand that the sort of chief mover in the creation of Middle-earth, Iluvatar, decided very clearly that there would be differences between the two. Elves would be the firstborn children and the men would be the secondborn children. But in Tolkien's mind, there was a difference between them that was just that irrevocable, because in exposition and in notes and letters, Tolkien makes it fairly clear that his original sort of emphasis and inspiration for the concept of elves wasn't necessarily from something like Celtic mythology or from Germanic mythology or even from Norse mythology. The concept was that elves were humans before the fall of man. So this relates directly back to the Adam and Eve story. If you look at the scriptural accounts of Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden, they were in an ideal setting. They were one with nature. They had everything that they needed. They had theoretically immortal lifespans, and then they fell, and the difference there became that they were more easily led into temptation, and that they had to face the concept of death. So that overlap has a lot of impact on how elves and men are treated in the larger Middle-earth world. Men are much easier to be tempted by the dark forces, and even when elves do sometimes fall to those, they also have a much more robust, what we might call resistance to the temptation. So it takes a lot longer for an elf to sort of turn to the dark side than it does the men. And also men are fallible and they die, right? They die at much shorter time spans. But it's also fair to note that the original men, so the earliest men before they got what we might call before they moved into the period that he would refer to as men of twilight, men had very long lifespans, 300 years, 400 years. And if you look at the early biblical accounts of the leaders that followed God, you see that they had very long lifespans. Now, this is also something that shows up in Mesopotamian literature, and it's fairly clear that Tolkien read all of that stuff as well. But the Mesopotamian literature overlaps with the religious material as well, because when Tolkien read the Bible, he was aware that the people that were given credit with writing the Bible would have lived in a wider world like Mesopotamia. And we know that some of this stuff does actually show up, specifically with particular words that you might find. For example, the Aduniac word for wizard is Zigur, which sounds a lot like ziggurat, right? Which is a temple that was built in Sumeria around the time that the biblical Hebrews would have been leaving. And we see the Aduniac language itself as a fairly decent example of a Semitic-based language. If you look at the way that it's organized, you can even go so far as to say that it's based on Hebrew. And Tolkien does seem to allude to this, and perhaps even a couple of times directly state this, that the language of the men of the West was based on Hebrew. So there's a lot of religious elements that come directly out of religious scripture that he would have been familiar with that show up in The Lord of the Rings. But there are even bigger themes, right? Like, the flood story where the world gets destroyed and the powers of the heavens reshape the face of the earth. And even beyond that, just the ultimate struggle of good versus evil, right? This is something that's very real in the Christian scripture. And this is something, of course, that had been a theme in a lot of other stories that he had read, but absolutely something that would have come from at least partially his religious ideology. So, kind of picking back up here, we need to talk a little bit about leaf mold. And you go, okay, why should we talk about leaf mold? This is actually something that Tolkien used as a very apt metaphor for his creative process. So this is a kind of a gardening metaphor. And Tolkien was always very interested in things like bugs and plants. And even at a young age, when his mom was teaching him stuff like botany, he really appreciated all of the natural aspects of that. And one of the things that he liked to use as an explanation for this is this concept of how the compost of your mind gives rise to new ideas. So the way that Tolkien would explain his process is that throughout the course of his life, he had encountered all of these different things. And we'll even add some stuff to the leaf mold here in just a bit that we haven't talked about quite yet. But all of these things would sort of go into this pile. And they went in like leaves. And over time, the leaves would break down and they would fall and they would turn into soil or leaf mold. And this was fertile ground, natural fertilizer. And this leaf mold would then be used to fertilize these new ideas that he would come up with. So when people ask stuff or asked things of him, like, oh, where did this idea come from? Or, oh, where did this idea come from? There were times where he would go, I don't really know where this idea came from. Part of it may have come from here, and part of it may have come from over there. And sometimes this didn't give questioners everything that they wanted, but it was very much the way that Tolkien thought about his ideas and his new creation. How do you explain how everything that you've ever experienced all mushes down and affects one new idea? How do you isolate all of the things that you have ever experienced and then figure out how to get one new thing out of that? It's a difficult concept to do. And Tolkien was aware that he had all of these inputs, right? We've already talked about all these linguistic things and all of these historical things and all these different works and all these different poems and plays and novels. All of that sort of went into his mental leaf mold. And when he sat down to write, there were times where he didn't really know what part was going to pop up. Now, clearly sometimes he read one thing and it gave him something that he really appreciated and really loved. But other times, especially when he was feeling perhaps lacking in inspiration, he would just sort of sit down and start trying to write. And this was not always an easy process for him, because when you have so many different things in your mind that you can call up, it's not always easy to just pick one, or to try to put all of the pieces together in the right way, or to figure out how you're going to fertilize this new plant with all the leaf mold that you have in your head. Now, a lot of stuff goes into his ideas, and there are some things that haven't necessarily been explained a lot that I feel we should bring in, and some of these are ones that we've mentioned a bit but need to expand on, and some of them are things that we haven't mentioned because they didn't necessarily fit in at another good place. But since we're talking about the leaf mold of Tolkien's mind, it's a good time to bring in other things that were inspirations that we haven't covered quite yet. For example, when he was very young in 1910, he went to see a production of Peter Pan in Birmingham, and it was a really impactful moment for him. He always loved Peter Pan, and from that point forward, the idea of, you know, never growing up and always being a boy, and trying to make the best out of a situation where you were effectively an orphan, right? This is going to be something that sticks with him, and he felt a special love for what Peter Pan represented for him personally. So that was a pretty big deal. Now, we did talk a little bit about his process of creation, but specifically, we need to look at how early this started in his life. How early did his process of making something new really begin? And we can trace this all the way back to when he first started writing, and his writing was fairly derivative when he was a little kid, but he was a little kid. But where is he making something really new? And this is going to be in around 1907 or 1908. So this is not too terribly long after his mother has died. He's going to start making up his first brand new language. And this is with his cousin Mary. And they're going to make up a new language called Nevbosh, which translates to the new nonsense. And even from that point, he's going to start this creative process of building new languages. And he started to work on his own language by himself, which he called Nafarin, which was based on Spanish. And these were the Spanish that he was learning came from the books that were in Father Francis's library. By 1912, he was already working on his Neo-Gothic language. He's going to drop Neo-Gothic and switch over to Quenya when he finds the new Finnish primer in Exeter's library. And this is something that's constantly going on in his head. And the reason I mention these specifically is because he's taking something that existed and then making something new out of it, right? So this is this leaf mold idea where he was learning Spanish, but how could he make that his own? How could he turn that into something that was uniquely his? So I'm going to make a new language, and I'm going to take some of the grammar rules from Spanish, and I'm going to take the way that the vowels work and the way that verb conjugation works, but I'm going to make something new out of that. Because even at this young of an age, when he would have been, in his teens, this was something that was already a part of who he was. He was already creating new things, and he was already building the leaf mold. So I mentioned William Morris in part 3. This is William Morris here. And William Morris was a British writer who is probably going to contribute several layers to the earliest version of Tolkien's leaf mold. And specifically with a couple of his books, Morris is going to be very, very responsible for the tone and what we might call the setting of Tolkien's writing. So we mentioned in part 3 The House of the Wolfings, which was a very important book for Tolkien because it gave him this concept of very detailed concepts of landscapes and this depth of time. But what we didn't mention in part 3 was a book called The Earthly Paradise, which was also written by Morris. And in the particular story of The Earthly Paradise, there is a character who is a mariner, and the mariner washes up on the shore of a new land. And this particular idea of a person in a boat that shows up at a new land is going to be one that sets off Tolkien's mind, because this is going to give him the final push that he needed to start working on his version of a man in a boat showing up to a new land. And we've mentioned this a few times with his creation of his character of Arundel, who was at that point, a human who showed up in what would have been England and met a couple of elves at an inn. And the elves, who were two of the last elves in England at the time, would then have basically told him all of the stories that would be the Silmarillion. And this is how Tolkien was going to create his mythology of England. So if we just look at this story, right, we've got elements from the Odyssey, elements from the Aeneid, elements from Morris, and elements from existing Celtic, Breton, and Germanic mythology all mushed into one, so that Tolkien can create his new idea of the world. And this idea of layers upon layers upon layers is going to be one that just really frequently resonates with Tolkien. And the leaf mold concept is a very important one, because he never really looked at anything without trying to compare it to something else. Now, also around this time, one of the things that he's going to be doing is starting to adventure a bit more in his own creative territory. And he starts doing stuff like sketches. This is a sketch that he did somewhere around 1913 or 1914. And this is a sketch of his Aunt Jane's house. And I think it's actually quite good for a sketch. But why this particular house? Well, at the time, Tolkien was spending quite a bit of his what we might call holiday time with his Aunt Jane. And it's in this house that he's going to write the first of the Middle-earth poems about Arundel showing up to his new land. So not only do we see a young creative writer, but also somebody who's going to draw. Now, this is something that Tolkien really hasn't received as much credit for as he should, I believe. His writing skill is unparalleled, right? I don't think that anybody is going to argue that Tolkien was a great writer. But he has a certain amount of charm in his illustrations, and I'll show you several more that he made across time as we go through our discussion tonight. But he's going to start seeing things and sketching them and seeing things and painting them, and this is just adding more layers to his imagination, because he's going to start interpreting things based off of his paintings. And of course, how he explains what's going on is going to be coming from a different location there, right? Visual stimulation is different than auditory stimulation. Why can't he, or how does he explain how this particular area looks? He could write it out and try to do it as best as he could, or he could draw it, or he could paint it, that sort of thing. And this is going to be something that he starts leaning on quite a bit. And it's not too long around this that he's really going to start working on this larger concept of what could be Middle Earth. And this is an idea that itself isn't completely unique, right? Even the name Middle Earth comes from an Old English word, but also it comes from the Norse mythology where you have Midgard, right? The middle part where humans live. So why is he doing this, and what is he doing with it? What's the new thing? Well, the new thing is an old history. And what he wants to do is set his stories in a world that is England a long, long time ago. This is not something that's easy for him to do, and he wrestles with this a lot, because in many ways he wants to make something that is uniquely his, but also he's got this drive to be the good, proper Englishman and give England the collection of stories that they deserved. So this is sort of where parts 1 and 2 and 3 all kind of hit here. How does he create something new if he's trying to create something that fills in the gaps of what's old? Well, that's not out of his ability to do. It's just not always what's directly in front of him that's easiest to sort of work out. Also, because it needs to be perfect. And he sends around a lot of his writing to his friends, and especially when he starts working on stuff that would go on to become the Middle Earth lore or arcana, his friends don't always give him the best of reviews. And this is something that he struggles with quite a bit, because he will get very excited about a poem and send it to his friends, and very frequently one of the critiques is that he's a bit long-winded. He just goes on a bit too much, or he's a bit overly descriptive. He could cut some of the words out, but he's trying to find his way, right? Not the immediate bestseller worldwide hit of Lord of the Rings, but how do you stair step your way up to that? And this is a process that is actually somewhat frustrating for him, because he gets convinced that he needs to write by his friends, and then when he sends his writing to his friends, they don't always like it. So what is he to do? He feels the need to draw and to paint and to come up with ideas, but then he doesn't always get the immediate positive response that he wants out of it. So if you've been with us through the 3 parts, you can see how this is a balancing act that's a bit of a fine line for him to walk, and it doesn't always end up very well. Now, around the time that he starts working on these poems, The Voyage of Arundel the Evening Star is the first one. This is about 1914. He's going to start envisioning the way that he wants his world to look. And we actually have some of his early paintings. This particular painting here is, as far as we can tell, the earliest painting that he ever made of Valinor. So Valinor, of course, in the final version of Middle-earth history, is the land of the gods and the elves. It's the land that's across the sea, where the elves sail ever to the west to live in peace. But obviously at this point, it's not something that is in its final form. Now, we do have a few elements that are going to show up. Of course, we've got a tree theme here, where we've got 2 trees that make the overarching thing here, and we can already see that this tree is directly attached to the sun, and then this tree is directly attached to the moon. And if you know anything about the lore of the Silmarillion, the 2 trees giving light to the world is a a very big part of the early stages of the Silmarillion. And here we see a city on a hill with a big spire. This is an original version of a city called Kor, which is going to be very important in his early mythology. But this particular painting here is from about 1915. And we can already see elements of what Tolkien is creating that are going to stick around all the way through until the final version, which is pretty interesting. Not only is Tolkien working on what he thinks Valinor looks like and what he thinks the world of Middle-earth should look like, he's also working a lot on how all of his different ideas fit together. And his love of language and imagery and poetry and prose are all going to start moving in the same sort of oceans. And what we find fairly frequently, if we look through Tolkien's notes, are these situations where he is going to end up having to map things out for himself, because he is very frequently going to end up changing things and editing things and moving things around. So one of the things that we end up with is actually this page right here, which I think is just absolutely fascinating, because this is what, and this is a note that Tolkien wrote in his own hand. So this is the Tree of Tongues. And you can see here how Tolkien has mapped out even how different gods are going to attribute and contribute parts to the different languages, and how all of these different languages are going to come about and how they're going to be related to each other, and how the language sort of flows from one group to the other. This sort of stuff is basically what the leaf mold looks like in Extraction, right? I could probably write papers off of how all of this stuff worked. And what's really fascinating to me is exactly how detailed that Tolkien made all of this. How each one of these different little elements is going to have influence on this. And he's even got a key, right? It's like little star here means that part of these languages are preserved, or partially or entirely, through other languages. And this sort of stuff is just very, very common. And he has many of these other elements and charts where he will start working on things like family trees, and how different elements of the elves work in motion as the time goes across his world. These elves were called this because they did this thing, and these elves who went to this part of Valinor are now going to be called this, but the ones that agreed to go but didn't get all the way there are called this. And he starts mapping all of this stuff out in his mind, because again, to him, he's not just creating a story about an elf that goes to this other place, he's creating an entire history of the world. And to do that, you don't need just the impression of history to Tolkien, you need the history. And a lot of his friends don't understand why he's doing what he's doing. And he fairly frequently has to just tell them these little summaries of, okay, I'm going to give you this, and remember all of these things. And it doesn't always sit well with people when he starts talking about how you have to remember this and have to remember that and have to remember this other thing and have to remember all of these things, because to these other people, they just want to read an entertaining story. But to Tolkien, you need context. You can't just go into the story without knowing the history of it. It won't make any sense then. Because again, he's not just writing a story, he's creating a world. And this is going to start ramping up, especially after World War I, When his two friends die, and he becomes sort of the torchbearer of the Tea Club when it comes to creative endeavors, he's really going to start working very hard on building up his work, and he is going to start working on these longer tales. He's going to start working on set pieces and adapting things, and the first three big stories that he writes are going to be basically the three main set pieces of the Silmarillion. And the first one is the Fall of Gondolin, and then there's the Children of Hurin, and then there's the story of Beren and Luthien. Now, he worked on the Fall of Gondolin first, and then Beren and Luthien a little bit, and Children of Hurin a little bit, and they all have their own different influences. The story of Children of Hurin is originally going to start in his mind with an attempt that he made to translate this particular part of the Kalevala. And the Kalevala has many, many stories involved in it, but one particular one is the story of this guy named Kullervo, who is a very unfortunate warrior who ends up going through some bad stuff. I'll let you read it. And originally, what Tolkien wanted to do was take the story of Kullervo and write it as if William Morris was writing it. So he tries to take this story from the Kalevala and write it the way that William Morris would have written it if he were writing the prose. But what he does in the process of doing that is he starts adding all of these different elements to the story, and then he realizes that what he comes out of it with isn't really the story of Kullervo anymore. It's something that relates to his larger Middle-earth, and that's how he starts bringing it over and attaching it to the stuff that he's been writing, and this is how we get the story of the Children of Hurin. Beren and Luthien, of course, is a fairly epic story. It's one of the bigger parts of this, and he had been writing this in verse, and he had been trying to write this in alliterative verse to mimic the style that he so loved from Beowulf. But when he starts having time with his wife, especially after they get married, he's going to realize that his images of his wife, especially her dancing and her singing, are going to be the inspiration that he needs to create this fairy princess. But Luthien isn't going to just be Edith. She's also going to be Rapunzel from the story in the Red Fairy book from Lang that he read as a child. And all of these different story elements start clicking into place in his mind, and then when he gets the story more or less fleshed out, he puts it into his world and then has to adjust all of the stuff around it. And it's just sort of fascinating to see how all of these things click together. Now, by the time we get to around 1920, Tolkien was very much the family man, right? I have a picture here of him in his backyard one evening with the kids. You know, the way that you would do if you're a proper British guy. I love the fact that his pants ride up so high when he's sitting in the chair. Part of that could be because of the way that the chair is, but he just always looks to me like somebody that his pants always rode up a bit high. But anyway, he loved being around his family. And even though he was a busy guy that had a lot of friends that really appreciated his personal time, he also loved his family. And a lot of the inspiration that is going to end up feeding into works that he writes comes from his family. For example, I've got some illustrations here. This is one of his illustrations of Father Christmas. So in 1920, he wrote a letter to his children as Father Christmas. And the story involved a lot of adventure. Father Christmas had to fight off some goblins that lived under the North Pole to make sure that he could get the toys out for Christmas. And there was a polar bear in some of them, and this became a recurring thing that every year he would write a letter from Father Christmas that described what would happen during the year that would eventually lead to the presents being delivered on Christmas morning. And they got more and more elaborate to the point that he started doing these illustrations that would show you, like, you know, this is Father Christmas himself, and this is his house at the North Pole. And in the process of all of these stories, of course there are going to be elves, right? Because Father Christmas has elves that help him make the story. And he's going to start working on all these different elves that are part of the retinue of Father Christmas. And one of them is going to be Ilbereth, who is basically Father Christmas's secretary. And Ilbereth goes on to slightly change to Elbereth, and Elbereth is one of the names of the Valar, who is the Vala that creates all of the stars. So even stuff like Father Christmas is going to start influencing his journeys through Middle Earth. And a lot of stuff that he ends up writing is going to be published along the way. And this is stuff that a lot of people probably haven't ever maybe even heard of, and almost very few people have probably read stories like Rover Random. This is a story that Tolkien wrote as a way to comfort his sons. So they had gone to the beach, and the boys had a toy dog that they had left on the beach, and either someone else picked it up or it got washed out to sea with the tide or something like that. But this caused a lot of anxiety, and they were very upset that they had lost their dog. So what Tolkien did was start telling them that, oh, their dog Rover wasn't just gone, he was on this grand adventure, and that he was going to see all of these different parts of the world, and that he was going to end up on the moon. And Tolkien did some illustrations. This is a tower where Rover Random is going to fly on the back of a bird. So you can see him up here in the corner, this little dog on the bird, because he wasn't lost. He had just decided to go on an adventure. And what we can see here is a parent who cared about their child, but also someone that was just insanely creative and could come up with these ideas and illustrate them, and create an entire world around this one little piece of story where they just lost a stuffed dog or a toy dog, right? He does this quite a bit. I mentioned this in part 1, but in the early 30s, the Tolkien family is going to end up with a car, and Tolkien was apparently a very bad driver. And he sort of terrorized small villages as they were on their way to visit his brother, and a lot of the family didn't really like riding in the car with him, and this is going to end up causing a germ of a story to develop, and that's going to become a book that he publishes called Mr. Bliss that he also illustrates. So then this is again an illustration from Mr. Bliss where he's wrecking the car. So even the sort of day-to-day encounters that he's having with his family are adding to his creative output. because to him, anything can be a story. Anything could be a story. There was a doll that his son Michael had that was from, or I'm sorry, that ended up being the impetus of Tom Bombadil. And of course, we all, well, I hope that we're all familiar with Tom Bombadil, character from Lord of the Rings, and the doll itself was sort of odd looking, and had a big hat and some boots on it, and Tolkien just started making little rhymes and stories up about the doll, and before you know it, he started writing sort of narrative poetry about it. And one of the first stories or poems that he wrote was about the adventure where Tom Bombadil saves Goldberry from an evil tree that had sort of swallowed her up, right? Well, that sounds like, oh, that's interesting story about a doll that saves another character. But when asked about why the trees were evil, one of the things that Tolkien referenced was the prints of a 1800s artist called Arthur Rackham. And this particular print is part of a series that Rackham did about trees. These sort of big, scary, imposing trees that are not necessarily the things that you would want to find in the day. Tolkien saw these and was like, man, that looks like a tree that would eat you, and just folded that into the story of Bombadil. So, Rackham had a big influence on his creation of what goes on to be Old Man Willow. So, if you know about the story where Merry and Pippin end up getting trapped inside the willow tree, but also part of that story came from another thing that happened with his children. At one point, they were playing by a pond, and one of the boys had crawled out onto the knee of a tree to try to play in the water and fell off into the pond, and Tolkien had to go swim out to save him. So Frodo gets dumped into the Withywindle, and Sam has to run out and save him from being drowned by Old Man Willow. So all of these things, again, just get folded in and turned into the stories. We've mentioned Farmer Giles of Ham a few times, based on his desire to explain why the area around Oxford was called the way that it was. But this is also something that came from his children's questions. Dad, why is that hill named that way? Why are we living in a city called this and a place called that? And the earliest examples of Farmer Giles came from him explaining, like, oh, let me tell you a story. There's this dragon, and there was this knight that was actually just a regular guy that was a farmer, and he ends up slaying the dragon, and all of these great stories just become part of his larger thing. Now, again, creation and sub-creation are not easy things, and sub-creation was not always something that sat as easy with Tolkien as he wanted it to, and he abandoned quite a few works. We've mentioned some of them already. In part 3, we mentioned his translation of Arthurian legend, The Fall of Arthur. He didn't finish that. There was another book that he started in 1936 with a bit of a challenge where he and Lewis decided to try to write books that were well outside of their comfort zones. So Tolkien started writing a time travel book called The Lost Road. And he actually tried to loop this into Middle-earth, and it looked like the characters were going to travel back in time to when Numenor existed. But he he never really liked the way that was going, and that got abandoned. In 1945, he started writing another novel that's called The Notion Club Papers, and this was loosely based on the Inklings, who had found some stories from the ancient time period that were going to loop into Middle Earth, that he never finished. And of course, the biggest thing that was always on his plate that he never finished while he was alive was the Silmarillion. And this is actually something that he tried really, really hard to bring into life. When he first started getting people interested in publishing his work, he submitted the Silmarillion many times, and nobody really wanted to print it. And at one point, he submitted this as a potential sequel to The Hobbit, and the publishing company said, "We don't really even get what this is." And this really hurt him, because the original version of the Silmarillion was what he called the Book of Lost Tales. And these were the stories that his first mariner, who had gone through several different versions and then was no longer going to be Arundel, but the first Anglo-Saxon that ever made it to England. It's a whole process of time. But basically, the original stories where the first person that learned about Middle-earth was going to find this Book of Lost Tales. And it was very, very important to him. But in certain instances, he would not really finish it. The first time he ever pitched it as an idea, the publishing company just said, "I don't even really know what this is. Like, I don't know how to do this." So he actually had to go write a synopsis. So the first kind of first blanch of the Silmarillion is actually a summary that he typed out. It's about 30-something pages long, where he tries to explain what the story is and how it all fits together. And that didn't impress anybody very much. And he was sort of determined to try to see this published, but nobody really ever would. And that really got under his skin. Now, what did he get published? What about The Hobbit? How did this come into being? Well, originally, he started telling these stories to Michael and Christopher. So these middle two boys. And originally they were just stories. They were just bedtime stories, but Christopher especially was absorbing this like it was a big tale. And at one point, Christopher recalls this instance where Tolkien was describing the Hobbit's house and had said that the door was a different color. And Christopher corrected him. He said, "Well, Dad, last time you told the story, the door was this color." And Christopher said that Ronald's response was, "Damn the boy." And he immediately got up and went over and started writing notes, because Tolkien wasn't going to be contradicted, right? If he was going to tell these stories and he had an audience, he was going to keep them organized. And these ideas started turning into collections of notes. And then about 1930, Tolkien was grading some papers and got kind of bored and turned one of the papers over, and he wrote the first line of The Hobbit. "In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit." And over the course of about the next year and a half, or 2 years or so, he writes most of The Hobbit from the stories that he had already been telling with his sons and all of this other material that he was going to bring in. And originally, when The Hobbit was being written, he thought that it was going to be at the same time, in the same setting, as all of the other stories that were in what we would call today the Silmarillion. So around the same time as Beren and Luthien and Children of Hurin and Fall of Gondolin. And over the course of writing it, he started wondering about that, but he didn't really ever sort of click over until he started writing Lord of the Rings. So we'll talk about that in just a bit. But he had to ask if this was okay, so he typed up a lot of it and didn't have the last few chapters, and he gave it to Lewis, and he said, "Hey, Lewis, do you think this is even worth finishing?" And Jack Lewis was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And he ended up giving the material to somebody that worked for the publishers, and this is where the publishers get invested. And when they say, yes, we want to publish this, Tolkien goes, okay, well, here's the thing. I've also got illustrations and maps, and I can do appendices and charts. And they go, whoa, 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 whoa. Why do we need all of this stuff? Why do we need appendices and charts and maps? And why do they need to be in color? And why does this need to have, a transparent page that lays over the top of that? And Tolkien goes, well, you've got to understand all of the stuff that goes around it. And the people are like, this is a kid's book. And illustrations, sure, but I mean, is the map important? And Tolkien is insistent, yeah, the map is essential. You must have the map. This is a world. And we see this sub-creator start bubbling up from inside. Like, where is all of this coming from? And when it became real, because they were going to publish it, it had to be perfect. And that didn't necessarily sit very well with all of them. When the first version came back from the publishers for him to edit, it took a long time. It took almost a year for him to go through the editing process, because he had changed his mind about several things, and he had tried to go through and rewrite some passages. And what ends up eventually happening is them telling him, you've got to stop working on this. You have to give us a final version. You must finish the book. And finish the book to him just didn't sit. He was still working on this all the way through the 60s. And in fact, there's a version that came out in America from a publishing company called Ballantine Press. And they decided to not use his illustrations for the cover. They ended up using this really odd cover that had emus on the cover of it. And when Ronald saw the cover of the 1965 Ballantine release, he hit the ceiling. He's like, there aren't even emus in the story. Why are they on the cover? And he was never really ever finished with this stuff, because it was a world that lived and breathed and changed. It would be interesting if I could get my hands on one of those old Ballantine Press with the emus on the cover. I don't know if I've ever seen one in person. Once The Hobbit came out, and it made quite a bit of money and was brought out in multiple print runs, the publishers wanted more. And Tolkien's response was, you should publish the Silmarillion. And people weren't happy about that. The initial company that published The Hobbit basically told him, we aren't going to publish the Silmarillion. And we want a sequel to The Hobbit. And so Tolkien sits down to start writing Lord of the Rings. And when he gets it sort of done, he kind of goes back to the company and says, I've got the sequel, but you have to agree to publish the Silmarillion and the Hobbit sequel, or you can't have the Hobbit sequel. And the response from the publishing company was, yeah, well, we're not going to publish the Silmarillion. And this really irked Tolkien, because again, this was the stuff that he had started on. This was his original creation. And in the process of writing Lord of the Rings, which was a very, very long process, he had figured out that The Hobbit couldn't be at the same time as Lord of the Rings because I was at the same time as the Silmarillion. It had to be in a third age of the world because a lot of other stuff needed to happen. And as he was writing Lord of the Rings, he started figuring out, oh, I need more history and I need more pieces because for this thing to happen, this needs a history. And this sword needs a history, and these mountains need a history, and this tower needs a history, and I need to write all of this other connective stuff. And this is where we get additions to the Silmarillion, things like the Akalabeth, which is if you buy a copy of the Silmarillion, it's actually 4 different works. The Akalabeth is the stuff that covers the Second Age, with Numenor and men of the West and all of this stuff. All of that comes from a response to, I need to have more history to justify why these events in Lord of the Rings are happening, because as he was writing Lord of the Rings, he understood that this was a sweeping epic tale that was going to connect everything in his world together. And to do that, he needed to flesh out more material. But that also meant that Lord of the Rings was long and that the Silmarillion would be long. And right around the time that this was sort of being deliberated was right after World War II, and paper was very expensive. So he approaches a second publishing company that is very excited to have Lord of the Rings, and they agree to publish the Silmarillion. But when Tolkien explains to them how long both of the books are going to be, they go, "Oh no, can you edit that down?" And his response is, "No, I can't edit it down. This is the story. This is a world. I'm not just giving you a book. I'm giving you the history of thousands of years worth of events in a book form. And it needs appendices, and it needs overlays, and it needs maps, and it needs genealogy charts." And this was just racking up paper, and they didn't eventually end up printing the book. He had to go back to his original publishing company and kind of say, "Look, you don't have to print the Silmarillion, but I really do wish you would." And they go, "Well, can we get Lord of the Rings?" And they eventually work out a deal where they can print Lord of the Rings, but then there's the whole process of actually trying to finish Lord of the Rings, because it was done, but was it done? And the answer is no, it's never done, because it has to be perfect. And the process of working all of this stuff out is not one that's easy for Tolkien, because again, when he realizes something that would make it better, he has to change it. He can't just let well enough be. And when he changes one thing, that can have ripple effects that has to change other stuff, because he's, again, not just writing a story, he's making a world. And the process of publishing Lord of the Rings was one that was fraught with almost constant issues. The first text was too long. They didn't like the fact that he was demanding certain numbers of maps. They didn't like these different epilogues. They didn't like the appendices. Tolkien wouldn't finish indexes. He demanded that certain prologue pieces got put in. He needed to have certain tables for the runes to be put in, and the maps needed to be finished, and the maps weren't even close to being done. What's interesting here is the maps were actually finished by Christopher, who seemed to be quite a bit more deliberative when it came to, "We've got to get something done, Dad, so let me just help you with the maps." And even when the first book gets to the point where they're going to publish it, then there's the argument of, we can't put this in one volume. It's just going to cost too much money. He didn't like the idea that it had to be split. He didn't like the idea that he needed to come up with now 3 new titles, because to him it was one book. And when Fellowship of the Ring came out, Two Towers came out not too long after, but it was almost a year before Return of the King came out, because he wouldn't finish these appendices that he insisted had to be part of the book. So when it finally did get out, of course, then there are multiple introductions, there are multiple passages that had to be rewritten. Then he had to go through the process of arguing with translators, and it was never the way that he wanted it to be. because again, this wasn't just I'm writing a book. It was never just I'm writing a book. And what's interesting about this, right around the time that The Hobbit came out, Tolkien actually wrote a story that did a lot of things that a lot of people might not have considered to be within his wheelhouse. First off, he wrote an allegory, and it's a full-form story, and the title of it is Leaf, and this is a story that's told by a little character named Niggle. So, Leaf by Niggle. And the story is one where the main character decides that he wants to... I don't want to spoil all of it, but basically there's this work to make a tree. But the tree never gets finished because Niggle keeps going in and fixing things and has to get everything perfect. And this is a very self-aware allegory of his own pruning process, where he had to sort of admit to himself that he was perhaps even beyond a perfectionist, just somebody that wouldn't let stuff go. This was in 1938, 1939. It's been published in several different iterations, so if you want to read that, you can probably find it online. So he was aware that this was something that was not really normal for a lot of people, and he was pretty clear to himself that creation was a long process. Even late in his life, the last decade of his life, he was still sub-creating. At one point around 1963, he created something that he called the New English Alphabet. And this was a better version of our alphabet for English that corrected errors that he saw. And he started writing his journal in his own New English alphabet. And this is something that has caused his biographer and some other later historians that have been able to get access to his journals quite a bit of headache, because you have to learn his alphabet to read his journal. But this is actually easier because in earlier parts of his life, he was actually writing his journal in Elven language, or in Elven runes, so English but written in Elven runes. So you kind of have to know his his languages to even read his journals. I mentioned this a little bit in part 3, but when he was asked in 1965 to write a preface for MacDonald's Golden Key, he starts writing, here's how you really need to write a story. And out of this comes one of his last published works in 1967, which is called The Smith of Wootton Major, which has also been published in many different versions. But he wasn't actively trying to write a story when he started writing that story. He was trying to set an example. Like, when you write a story and it's about these things, you should start it off like this. Here's a sample opening. And then that just turned into an entire story that ended up getting published. He's constantly going to work on revising Lord of the Rings. He's constantly going to work on revising The Hobbit. And he's constantly going to try to get the Silmarillion to publish. Now, it's almost kind of the great failure of his career that nobody would ever publish the Silmarillion. It took his passing and his son Christopher editing the Silmarillion into a final version for anybody to pass it, or to publish it. But that was ironically where it began, right? Because the early stories that he wrote weren't The Hobbit or weren't The Lord of the Rings. They were stories that would have ended up in the Silmarillion, and those never got published. And to him, he was working on these all the way up until just a couple of, like right before he died, was still trying to get the Silmarillion in a way that he could finish it and publish it. But a a final sort of closing for this particular discussion, which is also something that is sort of going to sum up the entire discussions that we've been having in these last 3 parts in this part about Tolkien, is an interesting viewpoint that he had about writing, and especially about creating. And in conversation with some of his friends, and then later on in things like letters, he explained this idea that he had, that when you finish something and you put it down, part of it dies. That as long as you are working on it or thinking about it or niggling with it, that it's still alive. But when you finally lay it down for the last time, that's when it dies. And if we look at what Tolkien's work really represents, the amount of effort and detail that he put into his works really can be summed up by the fact that he didn't necessarily want to get them to a point where they were always going to be completely finished, because to him, these stories were alive and they were real, and he didn't want them to die. And it's really poignant for us looking back. Now he died in 1973, so he's been dead 50 years this year. That we're still talking about how important his stories are and how much we appreciate and how much we love his writings, and that keeps a little bit of it alive, right? Even though he can't work on them anymore, we're still thinking about them and we still appreciate them. So they're still alive for us. And I kind of wanted to wrap up here. I found this great picture of Ronald and Edith towards the end of their lives, just obviously happy in each other's presence. And if you can't tell, Tolkien is a massive influence for me, and I've really come to love what he did, and it's a big part of my life. So I hope that you all have appreciated this series as much as I have, and thanks everybody for tuning in and being involved, and we will answer some questions and then kind of wrap up for the night.